And this week we're going to begin with The Merchant of Death, a lit RPG adventure series Eternal War Online, book number 1. It is written by Jared Mandani, who's written several other lit RPG stories that kind of hit and miss sometimes. This one is 342 pages. It is $3.99. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. And here's the author's description. After a mission gone awry, secret operative John Taggart's identity is compromised. He needs to go into hiding until he can afford the surgery to get a new face. All the cash he had left, he invested to buy a hacked virtual reality collar off of the black market. For a wanted man such as himself, this was the only way to make any kind of money without further jeopardizing his location and identity. There's a problem, though. When he first logs onto Eternal War Online and chooses his faction, the network detects his unauthorized device and generates a bunch of critical errors. Immediately, there's a hotfix that is applied which erases all his selections. John is sent into the Eternal Battlefield, the highest level PvP area of the game, obviously with no chance of survival. Limited to one character by collar, John finds himself in a dire situation. With no faction to back him up, he's a free target for everyone. And with no fighting skills and no gear except for a pair of cotton briefs, he's no match for any of the players. John will keep dying and respawning in that impossible location, but as he tries to keep to the shadows and stay alive, he will soon find that his strange predicament is not without benefits. For one, his lack of ties to any faction allows him to loot every corpse, which will lead him to unlock secret classes like Salvager and Smuggler. Secondly, while every faction has its own language that prevents players from different groups from talking to each other, he's not restricted by that constraint and can understand everyone. Unable to join the fight as every blow sustained results in his insta-death, John will discover that his only chance to start earning some cash will be to partner up with the criminal underworld in the game and set up salvaging operations. For a fee, he will loot you and return your soul-bound items, allowing you to skip the 6-hour wait period before they materialize back in your inventory. Also, he will experiment with crafting and creating weapons and enchantments that will start to shake things up in the game. Obviously, not everyone will take kindly to his bold moves, and John will extract the wrath of a few powerful players, but then you can't expect to please everyone when you're making a name for yourself as a merchant of death. So there we go. That's a very wordy description, but it does a good job of describing essentially the main story points. The cover art on this is really nice. It's actually what drew me to it. It was like, oh, that's really pretty and colorful, and it has some nice notification stuff, which is always a good way to catch a liturgy reader's attention. I like that. I actually like the idea of a merchant character in a liturgy story. So those ideas are very fascinating. The execution here, unfortunately, started out decently, but it eventually became kind of disappointing for me, at least. Eventually, and that's mostly because I realized, even though the story has a lot of notifications, it feels like the game mechanics are dictated by the story and not the other way. And this is just honestly a personal writing style that every author kind of has to choose at some point, whether or not they're going to create a game world and let the story be shaped by the rules of that world. The same way that, you know, in stories on Earth, you know, the story is sometimes shaped by physics, and that some things are possible, some things aren't. Or in magical fantasy stories, you know, the story is sometimes shaped by the actual rules that the author has set for magical stuff. The other option is that as your story progresses, you're shaping your rules to accommodate that story. And sometimes that works out really well. In this case, it didn't work for me. Often in the story, it felt like new rules were made just to push the story in a certain direction or justify this particular premise that didn't really make sense to my gamer brain. And in the story, there were often exceptions made to the game rules, and that they were ignored. Like the established gamers that were put in place were ignored as the story went on in the favor of some particular story point, or just because they didn't mesh or the author didn't care about them anymore for some reason. And so all that kind of concludes into like this ending that was honestly just kind of disappointing and rushed for me. So that's kind of the summary review. The story itself follows one player who gets glitched. And actually the novel description does a really good job of like describing this better than I do probably. He can't join the game's 3 factions. He can't he can't fight, and that's kind of an interesting point. It's supposed to be because he gets respawned so often, he gets this huge XP penalty for combat specifically, and also some of his, but he's level 1, so he's not really losing levels. And he has to figure out some other way to level and to survive, and so he becomes a smuggler and a scavenger. And he tries to create a way to earn in-game money so he can afford his thing, his face surgery, as described in the novel description. And he starts building a criminal empire with the different factions and the groups. And it's an interesting story in that respect, that aspect of it. Oh, that was like a nice thing. But, there is because the main character's ability to fight is cut off very early in the story. There is no action here. I mean, there's a little bit of action towards the end of the story, but it feels a little forced because you can tell, like, as soon as you see, like, oh, that I know where that's going to go. But overall, there's not really a lot of action here. And again, that's mostly because the main character does not have a way to fight, and he's insta-killed apparently by anybody who hits him, no matter what level he is, which means the levels don't matter. But that's a separate issue. But there's really nothing to replace that excitement from combat. There's a little bit of tension with him creating connections with the various criminal elements in the the 3 factions. But he's never really going to lose anything because he just respawns. And so there's not really a ton of tension here. Eventually the story kind of loses steam for me, and you get a lot more summaries towards the end of like the last third of the story. Instead of actually showing events anymore, that the author just summarizes, like, oh, sometimes I think there's going to be a really big fight up ahead. And then it's like the next chapter, oh, and nope, just a little brief summary of like, oh, this happened. And they move on. I'm like, oh, that's unfortunate. You can kind of feel like the author seemed to have run out of steam in that last third of the novel, especially at the very end. And it was just, again, kind of got disappointing. On the game mechanic side, the story is letter PG technically. The main character starts off with a broken character. He levels up. He gets some professions. He gains stats. And there are a lot of item descriptions, at least in the first half of the story. However, though those elements exist, the story progresses, and you can tell that the game mechanics don't matter. And that was was really disappointing to me, because like I come into Letter PG, I specifically read it because I love those game mechanics. I love learning about the rules of this world and how they can be exploited or learned about to quantifiably show progress, to make me feel like I'm that character and that I'm getting better and I'm getting more powerful. And if those game mechanics don't matter, if the story is just going to do what it does, regardless of what those game mechanics are, then that just loses my favorite element of the story. And again, this doesn't happen initially. Like I said, the initial beginning of the story, that isn't shown. Like the story feels relatively, because there's a lot of info dumping of like, oh, this is what the game rule is, these mechanics, etc. But then as the story continues on, especially after the 40% mark, you can really tell that, oh, all the stuff that was built up doesn't really matter because they're ignored by the story. And just a couple examples of like, there's a really big experience in the beginning of the novel where the XP penalty is huge and the main character dies again and again and again in that PvP zone that's described in the novel description. And it's a huge XP penalty loss. But when that same thing happens again later on after the 40% mark, there is no XP penalty. The main character doesn't lose levels. He doesn't lose experience points, and there's no consequences for dying suddenly. And it's just one of those things like, oh, this game mechanic is being ignored even though it was previously established. The same thing with those soulbound items. In the beginning of the story, those soulbound items are worthless to the main character because they're just going to reappear in in those characters' inventories because they're soulbound. You know, they actually should. I don't think they should even be takenable from a body, but later on in the story, and it's also clearly established that the main character shouldn't be able to use soulbound items in any way, shape, or form because they're bound to somebody else. But again, later in the story, the main character is just, oh, look, he's stealing soulbound items left and right, selling them off to characters that aren't the owners. And even using them. And I'm like, oh, that's a total breaking of the rules. And there's just like a lot of those examples as the story continues on where it's like, oh, it's more fun to write this particular story. And I'm not going to dispute that. But it does have to break the rules of that already established. I'm like, that always kind of bugs my brain. And if it doesn't bug you, you might just like this story better than me. But as the story progresses, like even a lot of the game mechanics just kind of disappear after the 66% mark of the story. You can really tell, like, oh, most of the game mechanics are being completely ignored. Notifications become less prevalent, and RPG progress ceases to. As a matter of fact, after that last third of the story, I think there's a mention of levels once, and that's kind of it. And that the main character progresses anyway, and even throughout the story as a whole, like you see those levels really don't matter, except for the fact that he gains a couple levels in the beginning that allows him to get a couple professions. But after that, like none of that really has any impact on the story in any way, shape, or form, which is unfortunate. The game rules still does, obviously, but like the RPG progression doesn't really matter, which is unfortunately disappointing for me. Overall, again, I like the idea of the story of a merchant, focused RPG's character, and I actually like the criminal element of it. I thought, okay, that's a nice attempt to make this more interesting. The RPG portion of the story, though, the RPG progression, just doesn't seem to matter and eventually does disappear. So I just kind of lost interest in the story because that's the part of RPG stories I like, the RPG stuff, and it doesn't, there are issues here with the story with it, at least for me. So for me, it gets a score of 6 out of 10. Merchant of Death, a Liturgy Adventure Series Eternal War online book number 1 with a score of 6 out of 10. It doesn't work for me.